Hello, welcome to my channel. This is Amber Rain Davis from NotableInk.com. This was an exercise that I did today after coloring a flower that didn't come out great. It was okay, but I felt like the shadows weren't exactly what I wanted them to be. So in order to practice, what I decided to do was use one of my Altenew Build-A-Flower sets and use that layering stamp in the bottom right corner that you see here to map out the shadows for me. I thought this would be a good exercise with a complicated flower, one with a lot going on, to get a better idea of where the shadows should be to make it appear more realistic. Like I said, it was just practice, but I am glad that I decided to videotape it because I think it was a cool exercise and came out very well. So first thing we're going to do is start off by stamping the outline image in Simon Says Stamp Barely Beige ink. This is a Copic safe ink that is great for no line coloring. Once I have the outline stamped, I'm going to use the last layering stamp for the flower. It's the last detail stamp. So that was that stamp in the bottom right corner of the stamp package that you saw. This typically, when you layer up all your layers, would be the darkest or the areas that are in the greatest amount of shadow on your layering stamp set. So once I get that down, it was kind of hard to see with just one layer, so I'm going to go ahead and double stamp those shadows so that I have a better idea of where I'm going with this coloring. Now, as I'm coloring, I'm going to keep the stamp packaging right next to me so that I can also refer to that. If you watched my last video, one of the tips that I gave was to find stamp images that also have colored packaging. It can be really helpful if you're trying to color to be able to see the shadows if you're just new to coloring. So the markers that I'm going to be using today are Copic W1, W3, W5, and W7. So even though the shadows are mapped out for me with the layer stamp, I'm still going in with my W1 first to kind of put down my own color, and then I'm working my way up through the gray. So 1, then 3, then 5, then 7, and then I'm reversing and going back down. I started over here on the right edge of the flower because it was really difficult for me to tell what exactly was going on in the center of the flower there. And that seemed a little more overwhelming to me than the petals on the edges did. So I went ahead and started there and saved all that business in the middle for last. So the petal that I'm working on here has a curled tip to it. So you can see that just tiny little white area that I left up there. And then I'm also, this wasn't in the picture there, but you can see I left a bit of a highlighted edge there. So similar to the side of the petal also being curled in. I thought that just gave a little more definition in between the petals. So even though we have it stamped out and even though we have our shadows mapped out, the flower is going to look like your creation by the end because you're going to be adding your own personal touches to it. It would be extremely difficult to color something exactly like the packaging or like someone else has done it. So every image is going to look different, and every time you color the same image, it's going to look different each time, which is nice. So let's walk through a petal. So I'm, again, mapping it out with my W1, so just adding some shading where that is. That is also going to help to, so that your other colors blend better when you prep the surface, prime it, if you will. And so I went through with my W5. Now I've got, or actually now I have my W5. Next I'll do my W7. And you'll see with each successive darker color, I put down less and less of the ink. And I don't extend it out as far. And then I'm going to go backwards and go back to my W5, my W3, and then back to my W1. I am trying to leave each of the petals with a little bit of white on the tip, especially if it's curled over. So when you have a petal that's curled over, similar to the last one that we did, you're going to have a shadow underneath the tip that curls over. So you want to leave that white, but then underneath it, you want to put your really dark color, so your W7 you're going to put underneath there. So I'm just tidying up those edges there, and I wanted, again, that's a curled part of the petal there, so I wanted to keep that light. So you can use your 0 marker if you've added too much ink. One of the things that's important when you're coloring, not just petals, but all things, is to make sure that your strokes are following the shape of whatever it is that you're coloring. So for the petals, you may have to curve in on either side. If it's a petal that dips in the center, then you're going to have a curve through there. So you want to make sure that your curves are matching the shape, if that makes sense. So in other words, these petals are long from top to bottom. I wouldn't want to color from side to side to fill it in. I want to go with the strokes and make sure that my strokes are curved, just like the curve of the flower. That's going to give you a much more realistic look in your finished product versus going side to side. There was about 1 hour and 15 minutes of footage for this card, so I'm going to finish up this last outer petal. Then I'm going to edit some of the footage out, and we'll move on to the center where there's more folded petals so that you can get a better idea of how to do those. One thing to note on this petal here, the artist added in some kind of dips into the petal there, so I'm just pulling that down in a triangle to shade those areas, and it just adds a little bit more of a dimension and fold to the outer rim of that petal. And then I just blend it out with my lighter colors. Make sure you still keep your highlight in there somewhere at the tip. Here's a great example of a petal that the tip is folded over. So again, you're going to have some shadow at the base right up underneath where the petal folds over. That is going to cast a shadow onto the petal. So you want to make sure that you put a dark line right up underneath there. So I started my dark line with the W5, then I added in some W7, and I'm going to add some additional shadow to that area as well. You want to make sure that you keep the tip that's folded over a nice bright white, because that's going to be closest to the sun, and there's going to be a greater highlight on that area. So I'm just pulling that shading down, and then just at the edge up there, I'm adding just a little bit of color, and then I'm pushing that back out with my 0 to make sure that I keep a strong highlight there. So we're going to do another one. So here's another folded flower here, and I'm heavily relying on my stamp packaging to get a better idea of what is happening in this center area. So I'm going to go ahead and outline the curled tip with the darkest marker, and then I'm going to go in and pull that shading out into the petal itself. And so I'll keep defining where those edges are, where the bottom of the petal is, and where that fold is. And then I'll just keep blending, adding each of the colors, and then pulling that out. So there's quite a few folded petals in here. I'm going to go ahead and pop on some music so that you can go ahead and see how that's done, so you can see it a few times and get comfortable with it, and then I'll catch you back at the end when we're ready to assemble the card. So with this petal that I'm shading now, it's actually cupping into the center, and so you can see where I have that dark line on the center that's curled in and where the highlight is placed, and because there's shading on either side of that, you can tell that it's cupped into the center and the sun is hitting it on the outside of the petal. I'm finishing off the center of the flower, and then at this point I really didn't want to do anything complicated for the background. So I decided to go ahead and use the accompanying die. This is a bundle that always, the Build-A-Flower sets always come with a die. So I die cut out the flower, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss my sentiment. The sentiment from the stamp set is "We Rise" by Lifting Others. I went ahead and did some stamp surgery. That sentiment was all in one line, so I cut it in 3 separate pieces in order to fit it on the card adjacent to the large flower. Be sure to have your heat tool nice and hot before using it on vellum, as it'll really curl up your vellum. And I'm going to go ahead and take this vellum strip and I'm going to score the edges right up against the cardstock so that it bends nicely. And I'll go ahead and flip over the card panel. And the card panel, I just took an A2 size piece of white cardstock and ran it through with an embossing folder. And this one is the Tim Holtz. It's a wood grain background. I'll look up the name of it and have it written down below. And so I'm just folding that around the edges. Sorry that I'm out of frame for that. And I'm just using some washi tape to tape it to the back since I'm going to adhere the whole thing to a card base. I'm going to take a white piece of sticky back fun foam and put that directly over that card panel, which again is going to keep our vellum in place. And I'm going to pop up the flower on some foam tape. I went ahead and die cut a piece of vellum with the leaf die, and I heat embossed just one of the detail layers onto that vellum for the leaves, which I think gives it a nice elegant look. And that the card is done. I think it added a few sequins, and that's it. This was a great exercise for me. It was fantastic to be able to see more clearly where I should be putting the shadows on complicated flowers like this. So I found it to be very helpful, and I hope that you did as well. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so below and hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Please also subscribe to my Instagram account at Notable Ink and my blog at notableink.com so that you don't miss any future postings or giveaways, which I normally do on my Instagram accounts.